Welcome to our third lecture of the week as we continue our discussion of World War II and in particular the domestic impact of the war at home, in other words, picking up where we left off at the end of our most recent lecture on Friday. And then we will take a look at the war and African Americans, the impact of World War II on the African American community and how African Americans served during the war, how they participated in the war effort. So let us start by taking a look at the home front. We talked about this a little bit on Friday with our discussion of the domestic impact of the war and how America's entry into the war essentially ended the Great Depression with the demand for workers to work in manufacturing plants and factories to provide for the war effort supplies, transportation equipment such as tanks and planes, arms and munitions. All of those things were being made in the U.S. during that time. We talked about the impact of Detroit in particular as the automobile industry factories almost overnight became factories producing planes and tanks and things of that nature. And Detroit became the arsenal of democracy on the home front during this time. So, given that context, we want to discuss women in the war and American women in particular with World War II. As you might imagine, with so many men enlisting in the war or being drafted into military service, that created a large number of jobs back at home in America that needed to be filled. Jobs in factories, jobs in government offices, administrative positions, things of that nature. And so many women joined the workforce during the war years. Traditionally, women were limited to the domestic sphere in American life. The priority for women was, at least in terms of American society, was to serve as a housewife and a mother and taking care of the house while her husband worked and brought home the paycheck for the family, the breadwinner, if you will. And we discussed earlier the 1920s, the era of the new woman, in which many women joined the workforce then, but many of those women were young and single women who would take jobs during their 20s or early 30s, but by the time they settled down or shortly after they got married, they would leave the workforce for domestic work. Well, now there was no alternative other than to hire women in large numbers to fill all these jobs that had been vacated by men. And women served in a variety of areas in the industrial sector, the white-collar sector doing administrative work. Also, women joined the military in significant numbers and participated in volunteer work through a number of charitable organizations such as the American Red Cross. As far as the military goes, women joined the military in great numbers. Approximately 350,000 women in total joined the U.S. military in some capacity. They served in all-female units, such as the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and the Navy Nurse Corps Reserves. There were other units as well that employed women during the war. And all told, when you add it all up, the women working in factory jobs, the women working in office jobs, the women volunteering, and the women working in serving in the military, more than 6 million women joined the workforce, meaning working outside of the home in some capacity during the war years. That was an increase of more than 50% from the pre-war era. So between the years 1942 and 1945, American women went to work quite literally in larger numbers than they had prior to the war. In 1944, the last full year of the war, more than a third of all American women were part of the American workforce. And what was interesting about this was the demographics. I mentioned earlier the era of the new woman in the 1920s. If you were a young single woman, especially if you came from an upper class or affluent family, it was socially acceptable to work in an office type job during the 1920s, provided that once you got married, you were willing to give up that job and that career and work as a housewife slash mother and doing all the chores around the house and running errands and taking care of kids and things of that nature. That was the prevailing line of thought during the era of the new woman of the 1920s, and in many ways that had persisted in America during the Great Depression years of the 1930s. But by necessity, American women needed to work during World War II, and it wasn't just the young single women or the young single women from affluent backgrounds. All of a sudden, you saw a significant number of married women joining the labor force, and women in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and perhaps even older, who were married and previously working at home, all of a sudden joined the workforce during the war years. In 1940, 2 years before America's official entry into the war, only 15% of the nation's married women worked outside of the home. By 1945, the final year of the war, 24% of America's married women were in the workforce. That was an increase of 9% in just 4 years, basically. So that's quite a significant increase for women joining the workforce. And some of these women really took a liking to the idea of working and having a job and the purpose that that provided them day in and day out, not to mention the paycheck that that provided them. Unfortunately, for most of those women, their jobs disappeared after the war ended, as the men came home in large numbers and went back to work in their old industries, their old jobs. However, this period sort of serves as a harbinger, if you will, for the late 1950s and in particular the 1960s and early 1970s, when women really begin to join the labor force in large numbers. And it changes the overall dynamics of the American economy, as well as American social life, with women working during the 1960s and 1970s. But we see a preview, if you will, of what that might look like during the 1940s, during the war era. The difference being that during the war era, most of the men were overseas engaged in military service, while their wives or girlfriends were back home working jobs, whereas in the 60s and 70s, men and women are both in America and both working in the workforce. So a bit of a cultural shift that begins to occur in this time period. It would go dormant for much of the 1950s when the men returned home from war, but would sort of have a resurgence in the 1960s and 1970s. Shifting gears, want to talk about another aspect of what World War II was like on the home front, on the domestic front. And this is unfortunately an ugly part of our nation's history, but it is reality and it needs to be discussed, and that is Japanese internment. Many of you might have heard of this before, but basically, as a result of the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a wide degree of anti-Japanese sentiment throughout the United States during the war years. Simply put, many ordinary Americans, as well as many politicians and other prominent Americans, blamed Japan for attacking America, attacking Pearl Harbor, and dragging America into the war. As a result, Japanese Americans, people who had immigrated from Japan to the country, and many of which had become U.S. citizens or were the children of Japanese immigrants who had grown up in America and were now citizens themselves, but of Japanese descent, they received hostile treatment from their fellow Americans. I mentioned this came from both regular Americans and political figures. In one particularly appalling example, the governor of Idaho in 1942, a man named Chase Clark, delivered a racist rant about Japanese Americans, and he did it very matter-of-factly without any sort of shame whatsoever when he said, and I'm quoting Clark here, Clark said, quote, "A good solution to the Jap problem would be to send them all back to Japan, then sink the island. They live like rats, breed like rats, and act like rats." Now, obviously that is an incredibly racist and bigoted statement that has no place in American society today. It should not have had any place in American society during the war years. But unfortunately, Clark was far from the only prominent American who possessed hatred and mistrust toward the country's Japanese immigrants. In 1942, the same year in which Clark delivered that statement, Franklin Roosevelt issued an executive order that removed Japanese Americans from their homes and confined them to internment camps. These were camps supervised by the military, the government, and more than 100,000, I think the number, according to your textbook, The American Yop, is over 110,000 Japanese Americans were interred in camps during World War II, and more than 60% of the internees were American citizens. So just imagine that for a moment. You have come over here and seeking a better life for you and your family than what you left in Japan. You've worked hard to become a U.S. citizen, a legal U.S. citizen, and tried to make ends meet, support your family. Or you are the descendant of a Japanese immigrant who might have been born and raised in America, and all of a sudden, despite your American citizenship, you are forced by the government to go into an internment camp during the war years. I mean, that's just incredibly humiliating, incredibly dehumanizing on so many different levels. Internees lost their freedom, and they lost their property, their homes, their farms, most of which had to be sold and were sold at a significant loss because it was a buyer's market at that point. They had to unload this property very quickly, and the U.S. government not only supervised this and enforced this, But for more than 40 years after Roosevelt's executive order was issued in 1942, the U.S. government didn't even acknowledge the fact that this was a grave injustice against Japanese Americans during that time. They wouldn't even acknowledge it. Finally, in 1983, the government did acknowledge this injustice, as I said, more than 40 years after Roosevelt's initial executive order was issued. A few years later, in the late 1980s, Congress passed a legislation that provided $20,000 and an official apology to each of the surviving internees that were still alive in the late 1980s. And that was approximately 60,000 people. So eventually they got an apology and a little bit of money to make up for the hardships that was thrust upon them unjustly decades earlier. But it's a very unfortunate chapter in our country's history. And you can sort of see some of that continue to play out in more recent times. Muslims and people of the Islamic faith in the wake of 9/11 have been subject to harsh treatment from fellow Americans. We've heard a lot of news stories recently, if you follow the news, in the last year. There's been nearly 4,000 attacks, verbally or physically or both, on people of Asian Americans and people of the Asian or American/Pacific Islander descent. And that's obviously in the wake of the COVID pandemic occurring, people blaming Asians because the virus originated in China. So what we see with the way that America treated Japanese American citizens in the 1940s, we see shades of that occur in the wake of 9/11 with regard to American citizens who are of Islamic faith or Muslim, and what we see presently today with regard to our Asian American community out there. So this is a trend that has a long history in America. If you take a look at the photo in the upper right-hand side of the slide, that is a picture of Japanese American citizens in an internment camp somewhere in California. I don't know exactly where it was or which internment camp it was, but it was an internment camp in California during that time. And they are being ushered into the internment camp by the U.S. military during that time period. So that kind of gives you a snapshot, if you will, of the rounding up of Japanese American citizens and sending them to internment camps. So I want to shift gears again, moving on from internment camps and from women's participation in the war effort at home and in the military, to now discuss African Americans and World War II. And before America begins its official participation in the war in 1942, there is a brewing controversy with regard to racial discrimination in the defense industries, as A. Philip Randolph, who was a civil rights activist in the 1940s, and he was the leader of a group known as the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. A porter is sort of a baggage person on a train, on train cars, and many of the porters on trains in the U.S. during the 1930s and 1940s were African Americans. So the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters represents a large group of primarily African American men who worked in the railroad industry in that porter position. Philip Randolph was the leader of their union, and he organized a march on Washington, D.C., with the goal of ending racial discrimination in the defense industry, particularly amongst companies that received contracts from the government for products and services for the Department of Defense that were largely white and discriminatory towards African Americans during that time. And Randolph wanted to end that, so he thought, what better way to call attention to this injustice than by leading a civil rights march, a demonstration on the nation's capital, right in as America is beginning to inch closer and closer to war. This was in 1941, as I mentioned. Franklin Roosevelt and his aides are extremely fearful of the prospect of this march, fearful of what it would look like from an optical standpoint to have a large-scale civil rights protest unfolding in the nation's capital as the country is moving closer to war. So he sought a compromise, and negotiations took place. Randolph agreed to call off the march in exchange for an executive order issued by Roosevelt that officially prohibited racial discrimination from companies that received federal defense contracts. And as a result, the march did not take place. Of course, 22 years later, in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. led a march on Washington, which you probably all have some sort of knowledge or familiarity with. But this would have been a similar type of march that predated King's March, obviously, by 2 decades. Of course, it didn't happen because the mere threat of it was enough to convince Roosevelt to take action on the issue of racial discrimination in the defense industry. And African American employment by companies in that industry that regularly received federal defense contracts increased from 3% before the threat of this march to 9% by the end of the war. So not a huge increase, but a certainly an increase nonetheless in African American employees for these companies that, as I mentioned, regularly received federal defense contracts. So an important moment in the civil rights era that kind of doesn't get lumped in with the mainstream civil rights movements of the mid-50s through mid to late 1960s. So, and of course, it didn't happen at all in terms of the march taking place. So I think a lot of people overlook it, but it sort of presages the civil rights activism that will come in the 50s and the 1960s. One of the leading African-American newspapers in America at the time, the Pittsburgh Courier, urged its readership to fully invested themselves in the war effort in whatever way they could. They launched what they called the Double V campaign, and that was a campaign in which African Americans would fight for victory over fascism in Europe and Asia through military service, while simultaneously seeking victory over racism and racial inequality in America. So seeking victory on 2 fronts, over fascism abroad, over racism at home. That was the Double V campaign launched by the Pittsburgh Courier. The newspaper implored its readers to join the military if they could, or volunteer at home if they could, or take jobs in factories at home to support the war effort. Whatever they could to help the war effort. The feeling was, if similar to World War I, when African American leaders encouraged members of their communities to participate in the war effort, the feeling was if they displayed patriotism and support for the U.S. military and the U.S. government, that perhaps that might lead to a decrease, if not an outright end, to racial inequality at home. We know now that obviously didn't work, but that was what they had in their sights back during the war years when the Double V campaign was in full thrust. Also, in addition to the Double V campaign, other civil rights organizations either are founded or experience a tremendous increase in membership. The NAACP, which we've talked about before in this course this semester, was founded in 1909, but it received a huge boost in membership during the war years. They went from 50,000 members before the war started to 450,000 members by the end of the war. So almost a tenfold increase nearly in terms of participation and new members joining the NAACP. In addition to the NAACP, I mentioned another new civil rights organization was founded during the war years, founded in 1942, the Congress of Racial Equality, also known as CORE. And we'll talk about CORE later as we discuss the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. But CORE is effectively born in 1942 in the midst of the war. If you take a look at the image in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, that is sort of the official logo of the Double V campaign. You can see the eagle atop two V's, one for victory over fascism abroad, one for victory over racial inequality at home. As it says, double victory at home, abroad. So democracy at home, democracy abroad. That's what the Double V campaign was all about. And you get a real good sense of that and the symbolism that accompanied that in that particular image right there. I want to talk about military service before we close the lecture today. A large number of African Americans joined the military during World War II to aid in the war effort. Some of them did it because they wanted to participate in the Double V campaign. Others did it to fulfill their patriotic duty, whatever it was. There were a number of reasons why, but approximately 1 million African Americans served during the war era. Many of these soldiers were serving in segregated units, and they were often in non-combat units under the leadership of white military officers. I mentioned the 350,000 American women that joined the war, and there were some African American women that joined the war as well, war effort as well, joining those organizations that I mentioned, the Navy Nurse Corps and the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. But they were those organizations or divisions, I guess, of the military, if you will, were segregated during that time frame. So white women and black women did not serve together. They often worked different shifts, different hours, and there were specific quotas for each of those divisions within the military sectors for women rarely did they have more than 10% of their total units consisting of African American women. A similar situation with African American men. As I mentioned, they served in segregated units, and they even had a separate military flight school for African American pilots. That was in Tuskegee, Alabama, which you may recall is where Booker T. Washington founded what's now known as the Tuskegee Institute and HBCU in Tuskegee. But there was a military flight school specifically to train African American service members in aviation skills so that they could serve as pilots during the war. The Tuskegee Airmen was the name that was given to the African American pilots who completed training at this school. Also, they were known by the nickname Red Tails. They gained fame for successful combat missions in the war. In many instances, the Tuskegee Airmen escorted American bomber planes into Germany. So they were really flying right into the teeth of enemy territory during the war, assisting the Army Air Force, which was made up of exclusively of white pilots at that time. So there's quite a bit of African Americans that served during the war. The Double V campaign was very persuasive in getting the African American community to participate in the war effort, even if they had been mistreated before in the 20s and 30s due to racism and discrimination and lynching and all those things. They were eager to serve their country and to display their patriotism and to help America out in any way that they could, to sort of prove that they were real Americans and that they were capable of more than being just second-class citizens, which is the way that most of white America viewed them. That's how most of white Americans viewed them, unfortunately, during that time. So that's a look at the war with regard to African Americans, a tremendous increase in activism from the planned march of A. Philip Randolph that was eventually called off due to a settlement, to the influx of new members in the NAACP and the birth of CORE, to the Double V campaign, to the Tuskegee Airmen. There's quite a bit of work done on the ground, if you will, at home and abroad for done by African American men and women during the war effort. Also, as I've mentioned in previous lectures, the Great Migration is still very much a thing during this time. It starts in the 1910s and lasts up through the end of the 1960s. But between 1940 and 1950, more than 1.5 million African Americans would take part in the Great Migration, leaving the South to go to the North and the Midwest and the West, seeking opportunities to aid the war effort through jobs, through volunteer service, or through military service. But that's taking place in America during the 1940s. And that will wrap up our lecture tonight, and I will talk to you again on Tuesday.